This video, I will provide you with an example for dealing with decks that might not be perfectly square or parallel to each other. And in reality, this is just another method you can use to double check the length of your stair stringers to make sure that they are going to fit between the two decks if the stair stringer is not going to be sitting on top of the lower deck. So the first thing I want you to do is lay out your stair stringer and then measure from one of the points. And in this example here, we're going to measure from this point to this point. And we're not going to cut anything. We're just going to measure from these selected points. You can select other points, and I'll show you an example of that here in a little bit. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're actually going to be measuring in between the decks. And that will be this point to this point here. And to get these points, you're going to need to actually figure out where the stair stringers are going to be located and mark the location for those stringers at the bottom and the top. Another measurement that might be more helpful would be to go from this point here, or the same one in our first example, and then change the location to the top here, where the top of the lower section of the stringer is even with the top of the deck framing, and then measure that area. So again, the top of the deck framing, and of course the other measurement here is going to be the same as our previous example. And like I said, you can select other measurement points if you want to. And again, here is the line that we will be measuring on the stringer. Next up, let's go ahead and pretend like the measurement between the decks was a little longer than the one we had on our stringer layout. And if that's the case, you can either add to the top or add to the bottom. And to do that, you're just simply going to measure from one of the points and then try and create a straight line that will intersect with this line here so that you can make this part a little bit longer. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. So let's pretend like we needed to add an inch to our stair stringer to prevent it from being too short. And we're just simply going to make a mark here and then square off of this area. And in this situation here, you might need to lower this line here. You don't really want much of the bottom part of the stair stringer sticking too far out of the hanger. So that means you might need to lower this line here to reduce the length of this line here. And if any part of this doesn't make sense, feel free to share that part. Any questions you have, leave them in the comment area, because if you have them, others might also. Next up, let's go ahead and pretend like the measurement that we took is a little shorter between the decks, and we need to reduce the length of the stair stringer. And again, we can measure from this point here to somewhere over here to reduce the length, or we can measure from this point here to the top to reduce the length of the stair stringer. And again, I hope I didn't lose anybody there. We're just simply reversing it, starting at the bottom instead of the top. And then you're simply going to square off of this line. Grab your framing square and then line one side of the framing square up with this part here or this line here. And then have it intersect with this point here and then square off of that. And then lay out for your hanger if you're going to use a hanger. And then after you have that section laid out, you can double check this measurement. And if everything looks good, you can go ahead and cut the bottom and not the top. We're going to actually sit the bottom of the stringer on top of either a hanger or a block of wood like we have here. So just a scrap piece of wood attached to your ledger if it's going to work out. Sometimes the bottom of this might extend past the bottom of your framing joist. And if that's the case, you might need to use a hanger. So not too difficult. You can see what we're doing here. We're lining this line up here with the top of the joist. And then we are going to check the top. Now, if you remember, I reduced the length of this right here, even though I didn't move the decks, to provide you with your first problem and provide you with an example of why we don't want to cut this until we've checked it. So if you have a situation like this where you're not going to be too far away from the position of the stringer, then you can simply mark this and cut it. And then after you've cut this line here, you don't need to cut the rest of this. You can set the stringer in its original location, or where it's going to be located and then see if it fits. And if it's either too tight or too loose, you will be able to remove some material off of it or add some material to the next stringer. So again, if I'm a 1/2 inch off, I can go ahead and add a 1/2 inch to either the top or the bottom when I'm laying out my next stringer. And this would be a good time to check to make sure that all of these lines are level for your treads or your steps. And again, this situation right here will only work if the stringers aren't going to be located very far, maybe within a foot. So if you do put this up there and it's off a little bit, then I would try to cut it a little longer than your measurement and then set the stringer in place and double check it. Just don't mark it at this end and then cut the stair stringer if it's off a little bit from the measurement you took. Because if these two decks are not parallel and perfectly level, then you could have a problem. And then once you have the length of the stringer determined and it fits perfectly in between the decks, then you can go ahead and cut out the steps because you're going to use this as a pattern for the next stringers. So for some, the next step might be obvious, but just in case it isn't, we're going to take our pattern stringer and relocate it. We're going to use the pattern to double check all of the stringer locations, because if the stringer needs to be trimmed or extended, then this tells you that your decks are not perfectly parallel. Or if they are perfectly parallel, they are not perfectly level. So if the stringer is a little short, you can add some material to the bottom or the top of the stringer. And I will be making another video on that to try and help you with which part of the stringer you're going to try and add the material or subtract it from without creating too much of a problem for the stairway being out of square. Here is one that you can use if you are trying to cut a stair stringer that needs to fit precisely in a certain location. So here we have a stringer and we want the bottom to line up here and the top to line up here. Now, instead of laying out the stringer and cutting the bottoms and the tops, what I would suggest would be to lay out the stringer and then just simply put a line where you want the bottom to be, and a line at the top here, and cut a stringer, but don't cut the notches out for the steps. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is if you make a mistake, then you can always cut these up for blocks or something like that. But you can just simply grab this board here where you think it's going to work. You've laid it out, put it in place, and if it does work and you did all your math correct, you laid everything out right on the money, and everything's nice and square and plumb and level, then you shouldn't have a problem. However, that's not usually how it works out. You usually cut your pattern and you set it up there to check it out, and you're going to chuck it. Crap, I can't use this. So the whole goal in making this video is to provide you with a method to cut a pattern that fits precisely exactly how you want it. You check it out without ruining a piece of lumber. So again, that's it. If you want to cut your pattern with your notches in it, set it in place, knock yourself out. But this idea here, for those of you who, I used to use this a lot. I used to do stairs where I had to have, someone would build a landing, and then there'd be another landing. I'm not talking about a concrete foundation, something for a deck or something like you'd be looking at here, but something you'll see here in a little bit where we have a platform that might be 5 foot off the ground and the other one's 10 foot off the ground. And I had to connect a couple of stairways to a variety of different things on an apartment complex, let's say. And the levels of the platforms were always the same height, but the locations were different. So I'd grab a pattern like this, carry it with me, and just simply make pencil marks on the pattern and then adjust it to the stringers before I would finish cutting them completely. So that's where this idea came from. So if you have something like this where you're off a little bit, and in this case we're off about 3.5 inches off here. Now, if you want to, you can always add. You would divide into the treads here. And you could, in this case, we had 7 step, and 3.5 inches, we divide that into 7, we get a 1/2 inch. We could always add to the steps. So instead of doing what I'm going to show you here, where I'm going to just simply add to the top of it, you could relay out a stair stringer and add a 1/2 inch to each step. Instead of making it 10 inches like we have here, you could make it 10.5 inches to get the same thing. But here we're going to take and make all of our modifications at the top of the stringer. We're just simply going to extend it and solve our problem. So again, you can add to the top, you can add to the bottom, you can add to the treads to make it a little longer if you need to. And in some cases, you're going to be spread out a little farther to where you're going to have to make the steps longer. And you're going to have to extend this a little farther, depending upon what type of situation you're in. Now, another thing, instead of cutting the top of the stringer like this, you could have it extend past. Same thing with the bottom. And the reason for that would be so that you could set something in place, set your pattern in place. And then right when you get it to where you want it, you got everything nice and level, you could just simply make a mark here and then cut the pattern. Now, if we reverse the situation and the landing and the stairs needs to be a little closer to the platform, then you can see here how this would simply work, and you would just cut the top a little shorter instead of a little longer. And in this example, we have modified the bottom. We do not have our level cut here for the bottom of the stringer because we might need to notch it around the landing. Something like this, of course. And again, this all depends on what you're doing. If you're dealing with a finished product, something that is going to be exposed, painted or stained, then something like this is going to help you out a lot. You're dealing with something that's going to be covered with drywall, stucco. You might not need to get this technical as I'm providing you with here. And this is kind of more of the example of what I was dealing with, as I suggested earlier. I was dealing with a landing for some apartments I did, where I probably put about 150 to 200 sets of stairs like this in. And I had to get the bottom, I had to notch it toward the bottom, because the notch on the bottom of the stringer was actually going to help add additional support, structural support, to prevent the stairway from moving. And then, of course, they didn't want to have a line across here. In some cases, I was dealing with a situation where I might have only had 2 inches of the front of the stairway sitting on top of the landing. And then you could see how big the notch would have been. Wouldn't have been happy if I would have drew that line straight across there. So that was the situation where I used this particular pattern idea and where it actually came from. And thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, let us know by hitting the thumbs up button or letting us know in the comment area.